Good evening, everyone. My name is Barbara Dobbs McKenzie, and I'm director of the Brook Center for Music Research and Documentation, and welcome to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York for the 6th lecture in our annual series, Music in 21st Century Society. As you may know, the Graduate Center is the primary doctoral granting body of the wonderful enterprise that is the City University of New York. Here in what is formerly the B. Altman Department Store building, we are a hothouse of scholarship across many programs, centers, and institutes, teaching over 4,100 students. In turn, our PhD students go out and teach over 200,000 CUNY undergraduates at the CUNY campuses across the 5 boroughs. As a community of faculty and students committed to the idea that learning is a public good, the Graduate Center regularly offers public programs featuring eminent thinkers, writers, and artists. The Graduate Center is not just a place dedicated to advanced education and research, it's also a vector of ideas, where issues and ideas are framed in new and creative ways and shared with the city at large. Tonight's event is a prime example of that. The Brook Center series, Music in 21st Century Society, aims to present talks and debates by major cultural figures addressing the changing consumption, creation, contexts, and valuations of music in today's society. The series is inspired and supported by Constance Old and her brother, the late Dr. Lloyd Old. Constance Old practiced landscape architecture and was the director of education at the San Francisco Botanical Garden, and later had a project at the Metropolitan Museum of Art identifying images of dance and music, which evolved into the Metropolitan Museum of Art Performing Arts Index. She has had a lifelong fascination with the performing and visual arts, and especially about how cultural ideology is manifest in the arts. Dr. Lloyd Old was regarded internationally as the founder of modern cancer immunology for the seminal discoveries he made about the relationship between cancer and the immune system. Quoting the Cancer Research Institute, nearly every major advance, scientist, and research program in the field of tumor immunology can somehow trace its lineage back to him, either through his discoveries, his mentorship, the grants programs he established, the immense research infrastructure he built, or the many other ways he worked to build and advance the field. And imagine all that, even though his first aspiration was not science, it was music. He aspired to be a violinist, became concertmaster of his high school orchestra and the San Francisco Youth Orchestra, and following graduation went to Paris to study with violin masters in Europe. Upon returning to the United States to attend the University of California at Berkeley, he trained and played with the Griller String Quartet, Berkeley's resident ensemble. It was at Berkeley that Dr. Old's fascination for science grew. While continuing to perform as a musician, he simultaneously began pre-med studies, going on to medical school 3 years later. Sadly, Dr. Old died in 2011, a few months before this lecture series was inaugurated in April 2012 by the late Charles Rosen. His sister, Constance Old, has steadfastly carried on the series since then. Both of the Olds have had a strong commitment to bringing attention to the City University of New York, and particularly to the music programs here at the Graduate Center. I would like to thank our wonderful donor, Constance Old, and the late Dr. Lloyd Old for making this series possible. And Constance, I think you should stand. I would especially like to thank Anthony Pizza, who has curated all 6 events in our series, meaning he's done all the hard work to put these things together. And finally, we're grateful to the support of the Public Programs Office and the excellent music programs here at the Graduate Center, our partners in bringing this evening to you. Let me outline the way the evening will proceed, and then I'll introduce tonight's speakers. First, we will hear a talk by the renowned musicologist Richard Taruskin. Then another renowned musicologist, Scott Burnham, will join Richard Taruskin back on stage for a conversation. Then there'll be a musical interlude in which Adam Kent will perform piano music by Shostakovich. And finally, there'll be a question and answer period with you. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers this evening. Scott Burnham was a faculty member of the musicology and music theory programs at Princeton University, and luckily for us, has now joined us here at the Graduate Center. His research areas encompass the history of tonal theory, problems in criticism and analysis, and music of the common practice era. He's a widely published author on Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and is the winner of the Wallace Berry Award for his book Beethoven Hero, among many other areas, publications, and accolades. Richard Taruskin is our guest of honor. Professor Emeritus at University of California, Berkeley, and you've heard me say Berkeley before tonight, there's a connection there with Dr. Old. Professor Taruskin has published many books and many articles on a myriad of topics, including Russian music, opera, historical performance, and more. Among his greatest contributions to the field of musicology is the 6-volume Oxford History of Western Music, the undergraduate classroom staple, Music in the Western World, A History of Documents, with Piero Weiss, the critically acclaimed The Danger of Music and Other Anti-Utopian Essays, and his award-winning book, Stravinsky and the Russian Traditions. But he does not only write for an academic audience. His accessible, seductive, often humorous writing style has made him a natural ambassador to all audiences. He contributes regularly to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, and other such widely read media. His writing has received multiple awards, including the Noah Greenberg Prize, the Alfred Einstein Award, the Dent Medal, the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, the Kinkledye Prize of the American Musicological Society, and many others. Indeed, the force and breadth of Taruskin's writings have made him a powerhouse in the discipline. And on a personal note, I remember as a graduate student many, many years ago, going to my first American Musicological Society conference. And I went to a paper in which Taruskin was not the giver of the paper, he was just in the audience. And that was enough to create at least a big buzz amongst the students, if not everybody else. There's Taruskin, everybody was saying. And I ran the other way because I was so daunted. I didn't want to meet him, I didn't want to introduce myself to him, because he was Taruskin. And so imagine my special honor and privilege in introducing him to you tonight. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard Taruskin.
See, Barbara, I'm not so scary. And I would say to all of you, please don't be afraid. It looks as though I'm about to give a Fidel Castro address, perhaps in memoriam. And if I were Castro and you were Cubans, you would have to sit through it. But I'm not, and you're not, and you don't. It's just that for about 2 years now, I've needed new glasses. And since I've been dilatory about getting them, I have to print things out very, very big so that I can read it without having to peer at my paper. I'm so thrilled to be here and participating in this lecture series. This is the Brook Center, and I knew Barry and Claire Brook quite well, and so I'm very glad to be in this way paying tribute to them. I'm also conscious of the very distinguished previous speakers who I'm following, and especially conscious of them because of the previous speakers. One of them wrote the most favorable review that the Oxford History of Western Music ever received. And another of the previous speakers at these lectures wrote the most unfavorable review that the Oxford History received. So you see, I fit right in. Or I should say, I fit right in between. So, let's get on with it. I thought I'd begin the lecture itself by telling you how I know that God exists and that he watches over me. Have I got your attention now? It's because whenever I'm thinking deeply or obsessively about some topic or question, usually in preparation for an event like this one, God sends me clippings. Things turn up in my reading or in my mail or my email or even in the news or in conversation or in everyday experience that assist my thinking and even answer my questions. So doubtless you are rationalizing this. I'm just reacting to my surroundings and experiences with heightened alertness, you're probably thinking. No doubt. But there are always coincidences that go beyond that explanation, serendipities that simply come to me from God knows where. And if God knows where, perhaps he's the one sending them. Now, I've been invited to address you today because I'm, according to the publicity that CUNY has been sending out, America's public musicologist. How's that for an oxymoron, huh? Owing to fortunate friendships and, well, God-given situations, I've had many more opportunities than most academic musicians have had to write for general interest magazines and newspapers. In particular, as you've already heard, for the New Republic, when Leon Wieseltier was the literary editor there, and for the New York Times, when James Oestreich was classical music editor. I wrote a dozen or so pieces for Wieseltier and more than 60 for Jim Oestreich. My career as a public commentator lasted about a quarter of a century, beginning in 1986. It still trickles along. My durability in public media was due, I think, to my interest in politics, and in particular, to my interest in the interactions between politics and the kind of music that I studied and wrote about, that is, of course, classical music, which is reputed, along with the other arts and sciences, to be unrelated to politics, and therefore exempt from political or moral critique. Possibly owing to the upbringing I received and the social conscience with which it saddled me, I disagreed with that. And my disagreement was, like, as we like to say in the academy, my disagreement was transgressive. It broke a taboo, and it attracted rebuke. I found I could take it. And as my skin got thicker, my appetite for debate got stronger because I truly believed that the debates in which I found myself embroiled were important. And I still do believe that. And if my appearances as a public intellectual or a public nuisance are rare now, it's not because the debates are settled or because I have won or lost them, but precisely because they continue even though I've already had my say, and I am tired of repeating myself. So in order to avoid repeating myself, I decided to rely for this talk as far as possible on the most recent clippings that I've received from the good Lord. Most of the ones that I'll be describing to you were things that I came across after I started writing the talk. Like the one that arrived in the New York Times, well, the other day as I was writing this, so that's what I wrote here. The other day, November 15th, to be exact, under the headline, "It's Official, Many Orchestras Are Now Charities." Remember that article? Probably you saw it. The article was by Michael Cooper, the Times classical music reporter, and it documented a decisive shift in the balance from ticket sales to subsidies from individual donors in the budgets of American symphony orchestras. You might be thinking, so what? Classical music has always depended on patronage. You could even say that's one of the definitions of classical music. But since the early 19th century, patronage has been predominantly collective rather than individual. That's what buying tickets to concerts entails. You become a collective or member of a collective patron. The fact that for the first time since then, since the early 19th century, audience support no longer accounts for the lion's share of revenue for public musical performances is, for many, a grave portent, as Cooper writes, of what may happen. When I do this, it means I'm quoting. What may happen as classical music's footprint in the broader culture shrinks. And we all know that it is shrinking. And I don't want to take that lying down. And my way of fighting it is to stir up trouble. Public debate is good for the high arts, which, if left too much alone, can easily lapse into moral indifference and social irrelevance. Of course, we like to call it autonomy. So we need gadflies and we need contrarians, and if no one else is signing up, I'll do it. One should be willing to defend one's positions, lest one fall into complacency, which is just a Latinate way of saying taking it lying down. Not to recognize that danger is to put music in danger. God seems to agree, or else why would he send me so many clippings? Now, the first piece of mine that elicited wide public notice beyond the music profession was an essay that I published in 1989 in the New Republic. I had written it during the fall of 1987 for the program book of the San Francisco Opera, which was putting on a production of Shostakovich's The Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District. In Russian, Lady Macbeth comes out, Lady Macbeth. I love that, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District. I was then newly arrived in the Bay Area after living 42 years in our fair city, where I had been pursuing a scholarly career on the faculty of Columbia University. I'd published a book on Russian opera and a bunch of scholarly articles and reviews, but the local performing institutions, the Metropolitan or the City Opera, the New York Philharmonic, and all the rest had taken absolutely no notice of me, nor did I expect them to. That was not the way in New York, where the academy and the public life of the arts rarely intersected, and I think they still fairly rarely intersect. That mutual isolation was considered normal, even desirable in those days. Academics were strongly encouraged to stay within their cloister, and forays beyond, unless you were a very well-established sage, were strongly de-incentivized. Who doesn't remember Milton Babbitt's prodigiously overquoted exhortation that the composer would do himself and his music an immediate and eventual service by total, resolute, and voluntary withdrawal from this public world to one of private performance and electronic media, with this very real possibility of complete elimination of the public and social aspects of musical composition. Now that was, of course, we snicker at that now, because it remains a very controversial thing to say about composers, perhaps more controversial now than it was in the late 1950s when Babbitt actually said it or printed it. But it was the opposite of controversial to say such a thing about scholarship. It was a truism with regard to scholarship. Indeed, you could say that Babbitt's whole argument was predicated on his belief that, to paraphrase a famous old aesthete, academic musical compositions should aspire to the condition of scholarship. But now, in the Bay Area, the public media were beckoning me. During my first week on the Berkeley faculty, my office phone rang repeatedly with requests for contributions, both written and oral, from the local opera and symphony, and it was one of the things that most convincingly reassured me that I had made an advantageous move by going out to Berkeley. I craved a public voice, possibly because I'd given up a career as a performer in moving across the continent, and so I gave in to blandishment, and I accepted the opera's dual invitation to write a program essay and also provide a round of preview lectures for their opera guild on Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District. I still do those previews on an almost yearly basis, even though, and here's more evidence like Michael Cooper was giving, the audiences that come to hear them now are drastically dwindling. Now, I had no idea that this gig with the San Francisco Opera would lead me so far beyond opera and so far beyond music into the wider world, but then I started doing my homework. I made a close comparison between Shostakovich's opera and this literary source, a novella by the same name, The Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, by a writer named Nikolai Lyskov. Lyskov's Lady Macbeth was a monstrous serial killer, But Shostakovich had sought through his music to create sympathy for her and justify her murderous deeds. I'm sure many of you have seen the opera, so you know what I'm talking about. He did this in various ways, but mainly he used his gifts of musical characterization to manipulate the audience's attitude. The title character's music is beautifully romantic and humane. All the other characters, and in particular her victims, are set out in ugly, lifeless style. It's an amazing musical achievement, and it served what seemed to me not only a morally dubious, dehumanizing purpose, but one that was all too closely analogous to the rationalizations that were given in Stalin's Russia for the suspension of bourgeois morality in the name of the class struggle. I hadn't expected to come to this conclusion. It surprised and dismayed me as much as my eventual essay surprised and dismayed many readers, because Shostakovich's opera is famous in the history of 20th century music for having been condemned and banned in what now appears to be the signal act of Soviet art censorship. Its fate had cast Shostakovich as a victim, and victimhood implies innocence. Shostakovich's status as an innocent had, about a decade earlier, received an enormous boost with the publication of a book that I'm sure many of you remember. It was called Testimony, and it bore a subtitle which identified it as The Memoirs of Dmitri Shostakovich as related to and edited by Solomon Volkov. You might recall that the book's first-person narrative presented Shostakovich as an embittered dissident, resentful after a lifetime of mistreatment by the Soviet regime. And here I was, writing of the work that marked his first collision with Soviet power. I wrote this: "So ineluctably has the opera come to symbolize pertinacity in the face of despotism that it is almost impossible to see it clearly now as an embodiment of that very despotism." I'm very happy to say that the San Francisco Opera went ahead and printed those words in its program book. Their program editor in those days, a canny Croatian woman who I liked very much, her name was Koralja Lockhart, obviously her married name. She joked to me that people reading it would have already bought their tickets, so say what you like. I had by then written exactly once for the New Republic, when Simon Karlinski, a Slavist on the Berkeley faculty, passed along to me a book he had been asked to review that was based on a dissertation that he supervised, which gave him a conflict of interest. Leon Wieselt here had written me a nice note after that piece was printed, inviting me to submit more work, so I sent him this piece about Lady Macbeth. And I added another paragraph to give it a more topical spin. The fatwa against Salman Rushdie over the satanic verses was in the news early in 1989 when this article ran in the New Republic, so I connected it to the matter that I was addressing this way. In the liberal West, I wrote, "As we have been proudly reminded in recent weeks, we don't believe in banning works of art. If it's because we believe that they cannot threaten life and morals, then we are more vulnerable than we imagine to the dehumanizing message of this great opera. If it is because we believe that ethics has no bearing on aesthetics, then the process of dehumanization has already begun. If, for its inspired music and its dramatic power, the Lady Macbeth of the Mid-Sense District is to hold the stage today, it should be seen and heard with an awareness of history, with open eyes and ears, and with hearts on guard." Need I even tell you that the mail ran very heavily and very abusively against me, or that writer after writer compared me with Ayatollah Khomeini, and of course with Stalin? That didn't surprise me, even though the paragraph that I just read to you, I think you'll agree, very plainly opposes censorship. I didn't find that surprising because I'd already noticed many times that artists and art lovers in the West had a hard time distinguishing criticism from censorship. Even had a hard time understanding the meaning of the word "if." What did surprise me was my reaction to their reaction. I was exhilarated. What exhilarated me was not, or maybe I should say not just notoriety, but the fact that I had elicited an excited reaction from a non-professional audience with a serious discussion of a serious work of art. And that had become a rarity. The isolation of serious art from the sphere of public and especially political discourse, which, as I've tried to show, and which many others by now have also shown, was an artifact and a consequence of the Cold War in the West, was killing off interest in serious art. If stirring political debate could revive interest in it and prolong its life in our distracted society, well, deal me in. So I've actually sought opportunities to pit ethics against aesthetics. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but, and here you'll recognize that I'm in the tradition primarily of Isaiah Berlin, precisely because both are right. Ethics and aesthetics, both of them actual goods, both of them actual values, they are, so to speak, independent variables. My other major skirmish along these lines, as you may recall, involved an opera I don't rate nearly as highly as I do Shostakovich's, and one that I subjected only to an ethical, not an aesthetic critique, and that only in passing, namely The Death of Klinghoffer, an opera masterminded by Peter Sellers, to whom I like to attribute it, its original director, with a score by John Adams and a libretto by Alice Goodman. I never said a word against its artistic qualities. I never even said a word about its artistic qualities. But in the years since I wrote about it, again, in the wake of something more important, namely the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, my review, which wasn't even a review, has always been the piece the opera's promoters had been at pains to refute. Rather than a review, it was merely an example. That is, I cited Klinghoffer as an example, among others, in a general consideration of the ethics versus aesthetics issue. Because of its recent date and its freshness in memory, The Death of Klinghoffer became, you might say, Exhibit A, the prime test of my case about independent variability. The connection between the opera and the events of 9/11 was the voluntary decision, as you might recall, of the Boston Symphony Orchestra to cancel a performance of excerpts from the opera out of consideration for the feelings of the recently bereaved. I voiced approval of that decision, and that once again brought forth charges of advocating, and in this case, even abetting censorship. The title of my talk today, The Many Dangers of Music, is a paraphrase or a parody of the title that the Times editors, Jim Astrup, put atop that piece when it ran. They called it Music's Dangers and the Case for Control. Now, 2 years ago, when Klinghoffer finally came to the Met, attended by the usual clamor, I was interpellated, as we say in the Academy. I was called out by various reviewers and bloggers who demanded that I comment on the new production, where in 2001, my defense of the Boston Symphony Orchestra had led to my being lumped by John Adams and a number of British journalists with John Ashcroft and Donald Rumsfeld, remember them? This time, 2 years ago, without even opening my mouth, I was lumped with Rudy Giuliani, who I'm sure you do remember. If those demanding a word from me had sent me airfare and tickets, I would have gladly complied, but I never actually got to see that production, and I couldn't fairly offer a take. I would like to observe, nevertheless, that 3 times now, producers of the opera have responded to ethical critiques of the work, specifically to critiques of its claim to even-handedness in the portrayal of the Palestinian hijackers and their Jewish victim. So they have responded to ethical critique even as they have consistently rejected the premise that a work of high art can properly be subjected to an ethical critique. And of course, that was the attitude of theirs to which I objected. The first time this happened was the original creative team responding. After the first American performance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1991, by removing a comic scene that juxtaposed a pop music characterization of the Jewish characters with the opening chorus, which portrayed the Palestinians in exalted tones inspired by the choruses of Bach's Passion settings. Second time, it was Penny Woolcock, the director of the first movie version of the opera, who responded by putting a couple of silent Israeli Jews, they were silent because no part was written for them, a couple of silent Israeli Jews, identifiable by tattoos as Holocaust survivors, on board the Achille Lauro, the hijacked ship. This was to balance the Palestinians better than American Jewish tourists who had no legitimate claim to the disputed land. And the third time was the New York production I didn't get to see, but about which I read a lot of reviews. Tom Morris, the director of the new production, responded implicitly to ethical critique by showing the actual murder on stage rather than hiding it. Now, I'm not claiming that these concessions were vindications of my own or anyone else's specific criticisms, but they are acknowledgments, even if only backhanded acknowledgments or tacit acknowledgments, that ethical critique deserves a response from serious artists as well as from purveyors of popular culture, which everyone agrees is properly subject to ethical scrutiny. So have you ever asked yourself, why is that? That we find it normal to make ethical critiques of popular culture but not of high culture? That's the question I've been spending years addressing. And all I've ever attacked has been the claim of privilege. I do think that the position that I've espoused over the years has gained some ground since the end of the Cold War in Europe, which knocked the strongest prop out from beneath the wishful old German romantic cliche that, in Arthur Schopenhauer's words, the history of art and philosophy is schuldlos und nicht blutbefleckt. Blutbefleckt. Say that 5 times fast. That means guiltless and unstained by blood. But even now, I am often brought up short by renewed resistance to my resistance to that idea, sometimes quite unexpected, and I don't at all take for granted that you, my present audience, are with me on any of this. My most recent reminder was the clipping from God that furnished me with my gambit tonight. I thought of organizing the talk around my clippings from God when I got this. I was already writing this piece when I received an email from the dramaturg, or maybe the program editor from the Bavarian State Opera, which is putting on a new production of Lady Macbeth by Shostakovich, in which the director is Harry Kupfer. Really great director, venerable by now. He's in his middle 80s. He's formerly East German, wonderful director. The program editor wrote me for permission to reprint my old San Francisco essay, specifically in the form that it took when it was published in the New Republic. They wanted it in that form precisely because of the opening that I had appended to the piece, in which I summed up the case against the authenticity of Volkov's purported book of Shostakovich memoirs. This book has been largely discredited in this country, by no means primarily through my efforts. The chief exposers of Volkov's fraud were Simon Karlinski and Laurel Fay, but I was the one with the megaphone because I could write about it in the New York Times. No one in this country, certainly no serious writer or scholar, would quote from that book now without serious qualification. In Germany, however, I am informed by my Munich correspondent, the book still has currency. And so they particularly wanted to reprint what he called the great Volkov part, especially since the conductor of their production, Kirill Petrenko, coming from Russia himself, has always had his doubts about Volkov. That's what the Munich guy told me. Well, so far so good. But then he went on. There's one big question, though. Your take on the opera is quite harsh. I've been discussing this with my colleagues intensively, and while we all agree that your perspective is as original as it has its merits, and is certainly worth hearing for a larger audience, I, for one, was thrilled to read a dissenting opinion at last, it sort of differs from our stage director's interpretation. Naturally, and not really a problem, but for us as an opera house, it's still rather a stretch to say in print that we play an opera that endorses mass murder. That isn't quite what I said. But I won't get into that because the man from Munich wasn't really disagreeing with me. He was just voicing qualms about the impression my essay would make on the audience to whom he had to sell the opera. I've heard this sort of thing so often. What Taruskin says may be true, but I just wish he wouldn't say it. And it made me even more grateful in long retrospect to Corey Lockhart for her jovial reassurances when I published the piece for the first time in the San Francisco Opera program. You might be thinking that this example only illustrates the difference between scholarly and commercial pursuits, we scholars being the virtuously disinterested ones. I will show you, though, that I have met with very similar and at times even more intransigent resistance from my own corner, from our own corner, I might say, to the academics like me who are listening. The Munich editor, evidently a very perceptive and subtle man, didn't ask me to suppress my opinion. He only asked that I add one last paragraph that discusses the value of a performance of this piece today. Why is it important to keep it on stage and ask ourselves the questions it poses? It seems to me that you do think this opera, as horrifying as it is, still has some greatness to it. Well, yes, indeed I do. And that's precisely why the ethical issues are worth discussing. Mounting a potent ethical challenge to what I see as destructive complacency about aesthetics requires that it be directed at objects that have unquestioned or even unquestionable aesthetic value. Denunciations, for example, of blackface minstrelsy or the caricaturing of religious or ethnic minorities in Tin Pan Alley songs, which are very common in the musicological literature by now, they raise no one's temperature because no one's cultural capital is invested in such repertoires. Susan McClary's, you know who she is, right? Susan McClary's stroke of genius was to aim her feminist strictures at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which of course is the icon of all classical music icons. No one could be indifferent to her onslaught. Unless you were a misogynist and proud of it, your aesthetic and your ethical commitments were placed in conflict. To attempt a refutation meant arguing on her ground, which is why most of those who engaged with her didn't actually try to deny that the first movement of the symphony contained, as she wrote, one of the most horrifyingly violent episodes in the history of music, let alone that it was an expression of the murderous rage of a rapist, which she put in the original version, which never had much exposure except people who were denouncing it. But that's what people mostly did in response to this. They denounced the assertion rather than argue with it. Nobody objected when Donald Francis Tovey called that very spot in the Ninth the heavens on fire, as Scott Burnham, with whom we'll be talking later, reminded me in his recent plenary address to the Society of Music Theory. Everyone recognized that that was just a metaphor. Well, guess what? McClary's interpretation was also a metaphor. That's all we've got when we talk about music, as Scott was reminding us. Scott gracefully, if tacitly, acknowledged McClary's version when he wrote of the sense of sublime catastrophe in those bars of Beethoven, sometimes heard as a forceful collision, sometimes as transgressive violence, that was the acknowledgement of McClary, always as supremely unsettling. So is there nothing to choose between them, between her metaphor and Tovey's metaphor? Scott certainly meant to imply no such thing, and neither do I. Which metaphor we choose makes a huge difference. And I mean to redeem this moment with something much bigger and much more basic in conclusion. In my most recent email to the Munich program editor, I gave him leave to write the requested paragraph himself, since I couldn't do it well enough in German, prescribing that it distinguish carefully between description, critique, and censorship. Putting our hearts on guard, that's the metaphor that I used in conclusion, means recognizing that there's a difference between arguing for mitigation of a crime, the way any decent defense attorney would do, and regarding a crime as virtuous, as totalitarian legal systems often do. The music associated with the title character in Shostakovich's opera does very powerfully signify moral worthiness and even innocence. The part about hearts on guard I wrote to my Munich correspondent is a comment on the unique persuasive powers of music, especially operatic music, the unique persuasive power that operatic music has always exerted on listeners, only masked, never diminished, by the formalist postures so common in the 20th century. Music makes great propaganda. If I were rewriting the essay now, I would include some more evidence that God sent me after I began writing this talk, and actually after I had my correspondence with the man in Munich, in the form of a book by wonderful Russian-born British musicologist Marina Frolova-Walker, who wrote a book just out on the deliberation of the juries that awarded the Stalin Prizes for music between 1940 and 1956. She shows us Shostakovich in action, and he emerges from the documents that she has unearthed as a functioning member of Soviet organizations and cultural institutions, performing not as a holy fool, the way Solomon Volkov characterized him, but as a canny politician. On the Stalin Prize juries, Shostakovich, far from a holy fool, was a holy terror. Outspoken, often to the point of tactlessness, exigent to the point of embarrassing his senior colleagues in pursuit of musical standards, and not only musical ones. Particularly revealing are the blunt remarks through which Shostakovich succeeded in quashing a Stalin Prize for Anatoly Alexandrov, who was a composer considerably senior to him, for an opera based on the Bella chapter from Mikhail Lermontov's novel, A Hero of Our Time. For all the excellent musical language, good technique, expressiveness, and the undoubted talent of the composer, he said, the weakest aspect of the opera lies in the lack of any well-defined and expressive characterization. And so Bella sings more or less the same musical language as Pechorin and the others. These are all characters in the novel. I'm not insisting on the use of Wagner's leitmotivic principle. There are operas where such leitmotifs are lacking, but the characters are still well-defined. Carmen and Don José are vivid figures, but here everything is flattened out by the same fine writing of a good quality. The main shortcoming here is the lack of definite musical characteristics. And this is exactly what makes an opera, in that high sense of the word which we should demand, a musico-dramatic work. Well, reading this, one's appreciation is raised anew of what made Shostakovich's two operas the great achievements that they were. In his critique of Alexandrov's work, Shostakovich showed his grasp of what makes musical drama tick. Indeed, what gives it an advantage over spoken drama. The composer controls more than a playwright can control by determining not just the character's lines, but also the tempo, the volume, the contour, and the register of their delivery. He, in effect, combines the jobs of author, actor, and director in fashioning, or as Shostakovich says, characterizing a role. And by exercising this multiple function, he controls more than the characters on stage. He also controls the audience's perceptions of the characters and manipulates their reactions to them. That ability to manipulate the audience's response is the source of the composer's power. And it's the source of music's danger. And it isn't confined to opera. believing that it's an important aspect of teaching music within a humanistic curriculum. An important aspect is to raise ethical as well as aesthetic issues, and to raise them with respect to art that we value. I have made it a habit to try to incite within my students collisions between their aesthetic and their ethical commitments. In the classroom, my favorite vehicles have been oratorios by Bach and Handel. The Bach example, as you could easily predict, is the St. John Passion, which, following its biblical source, the Gospel according to St. John, names die Juden, in Luther's translation, the Jews, as the crowd calling for the death of Christ, rather than das Volk, the people, the way St. Matthew had it in his Gospel, and Bach, therefore, in his Passion. I began using it as an instrument for raising ethical issues as a result of an incident that took place early in my teaching career. Before I had ever thought to depart from the attitudes that had been instilled in me by my training. My earlier habit had been to present the two passions side by side, representing the St. Matthew Passion by its monumental and essentially pictorial opening chorus, characterizing the whole oratorio through it as a contemplative work, and representing the St. John Passion with the tense exchange between, it's an exchange carried on in recitative and in choral recitative, so-called turba choruses, between Pontius Pilate and the crowd who will not allow him to let Jesus off. And that characterizes its whole oratorio as a more dramatic, quasi-operatic work. It was a student who was made uncomfortable by the characterization of the crowd as Jews, because she recognized the word Juden as meaning Jews, who queried the appropriateness of using that particular part of the St. John Passion as an illustration. She put me on the spot. At which point another student said, but the Jews, after all, were responsible for the death of Christ. I asked him, in preparation for the discussion that I saw we were going to have, how he knew that. From Bach, was the answer. And yeah, it shocked me, because for the first time I was actually seeing that a great work of art had done someone harm. So that became the topic of the day, and it's been a topic for me ever since. The strategy I adopted from then on, which is now reflected also in the Oxford history, is to present the two passions side by side, hoping that nobody will notice the Jews the first time around, so that later I can come back and confront the class or confront my readers of the Oxford history with the matter and ask them, given that no reputable historian today blames the Jews for the death of Christ, and even the Catholic Church, as you know, got around to absolving them in 1964, whether it is objectionable to perform a text that incorporates a libel that has led to bloody persecutions. There are many possible answers to that question, and I don't necessarily endorse any one of them. It's the question that I consider important. And I insist that the question be properly framed, not whether St. John was right or wrong, the writer of the Gospel was right or wrong to blame the Jews, not whether J.S. Bach was personally anti-Semitic, because people always want to defend him personally, or whether exposure to the work can affect belief, since I have evidence that it can and has. The question doesn't involve Bach. And it doesn't involve the congregation of religious believers that he served with his art, but it involves the people who perform the work today, and particularly those who perform the work under secular auspices before religiously and ethnically mixed audiences. What are their ethical responsibilities? Do they have ethical responsibilities? If so, to whom do they have ethical responsibilities? Bach is long dead, I wrote in the Oxford history, but the St. John Passion lives on. Jews not only hear it nowadays, they often participate in performances of it, and they're sometimes shocked to learn what it is that they're singing. And here I was thinking of the incident that took place at Swarthmore College, when students their chorus was putting on the St. John Passion, and some of the Jewish kids who were singing noticed die Juden. They didn't know any German, so they thought Bach was saying, die, Juden. But, you know, but they still weren't wrong. The way they solved it at Swarthmore was to call Professor Michael Morrison on their faculty, who was a Bach specialist, into the discussion, and eventually it resulted in the publication of his wonderful book called Lutheranism, Anti-Judaism, and Bach's St. John Passion, which I very heartily recommend to you. But back to the Oxford history. So are they wrong? That is, those who notice and object. Does Bach's music redeem the text? Would it impair Bach's work from the standpoint of its present social use if the text were amended to exclude the blood libel? And if people disagree about the answers to these difficult questions, on what basis can they be adjudicated? It's no part of the purpose of this book to provide the answers to this question, but it is integral to its purpose to raise them. So let me ask you, do you agree? Not everyone does. The Oxford History's most distinguished reviewer, Charles Rosen, objected vociferously to my raising these questions. He wrote, Taruskin asks if we have the right to listen to the chorus in Bach's St. John Passion, where the Jews demand the death of Jesus. He hastens to say that he's only posing the question, not giving an answer. But some questions are too foolish to be asked. Actually, I agree with Rosen. That question is indeed too foolish to be asked, but it wasn't my question. To deflect the question onto the matter of rights, you know, do we have the right to listen to it? I never asked that. But that makes it very easy for the critic, because yet again, it stigmatizes ethical concerns as censorship, which enabled Rosen to admonish me that the proposal to censor the art of the past to hide unpleasant aspects of history puts Taruskin with one foot in the camp of those who would ban Huckleberry Finn from the shelves of our school libraries. But as I hope you will agree, I actually am with both feet in the camp of those who would insist on devoting time in the classroom to examining Huckleberry Finn precisely and explicitly in an effort to understand unpleasant aspects of history as a way of strengthening our ability to view the beliefs of our ancestors and our own beliefs as well, freely and critically. That, after all, is the purpose of education and of scholarship. At least that's what I think. But perhaps more debatably, I contend that a promise not to censor implies a promise to critique. And I've been acting on that contention in my public work. The specific purpose to which the passage from the Oxford History that I've just read you concerning the St. John Passion was addressed was the purpose of exposing rhetorical strategies, both in the historiography of art and in the works of art that are the subject of historiography, and the harm that rhetorical strategies can do. I think it's remarkable that my calling attention to this potentiality has made me a controversial figure on today's musical intellectual scene. People have been writing about the danger of music since, well, Plato, at least. The danger of art in general, actually, in the case of Plato. There's no music history text or anthology of source readings that doesn't include the passages from the Republic on the dangers of music. The ethical thread runs through the whole history of music and philosophy, from St. Augustine and any number of other church fathers to Vincenzo Galilei and any number of other Florentine humanists, all the way to Wagner, to Nietzsche, to Tolstoy, and into the 20th century when people began to laugh the question down. Here's a story we've all snickered at, I'll bet, which was already old in the time of Boethius, who wrote in the 6th century after Christ. And Boethius asked, "Is there anyone who does not know the tale about the young man from Taormina who, drunk and excited by the sound of the Hypophrygian mode, was calmed by Pythagoras, who brought him back to his senses by changing the music to a spondee? Whereas a prostitute had been locked up in the house of a rival, and whereas he, in a frenzy, wanted to burn the place down, Pythagoras, who was watching the night sky, as usual, and observing the course of the stars, having realized that, excited as he was by the Phrygian mode, he would refuse, despite the many warnings of his friends to change his mind, advised that the mode be changed, thus tempering the frenzy in the young man's soul and restoring him to a peaceful state of mind. I once heard a wonderful old medievalist musicologist named Luther Dittmer, who was a City University professor, so maybe some of you remember him. I saw Luther Dittmer get a very easy laugh by telling a version of this story and adding tunings on request. Now, from then on, I got the same laugh many times. You know, that's how academic humor works. We steal it from each other. But that laugh is a nervous laugh. Even if this version of musical ethos is hyperbolic, the way parables are always hyperbolic, right? We all know that the phenomenon that it dramatizes is real. It is not that musical ethos has been refuted and we no longer believe in it. Rather, it has been exercised and we no longer assent to it. When we're talking, that is, about classical music. In other musical contexts, discussion of musical ethos is allowed. The translation from Boethius that I just read comes from the American edition of a very serious study by Gilbert Rouget, a French ethnomusicologist who, by the way, last July celebrated his 100th birthday. Still alive. The book is called Music in Trance, and it's a book mainly about contemporary African music. So in the study of cult music, ethos is tolerated. Another area in which American ethnomusicologists and sociologists enthusiastically study musical ethos is in the context of political and social activism. One of the clippings God sent me as I started work on this talk came by way of the AMS list, the web list of the American Musicological Society, which on November 9th, last month, sent around an announcement of a conference at UCLA to take place this coming April. The propedeutic accompanying the call for papers asserts that music is an art tradition that historically foments new collective identities and galvanizes movements, relays a complex relationship between cultural tradition and cultural change. How does music reflect and respond to evolving political climates? What solidarity arises from the unifying effect of music implemented in action? How can music elicit social and political change? This conference seeks to investigate the intricate and infinite ways in which music, culture, and social movements interact. Mutatis mutandis, that might have been written by Saint Basil of Caesarea, 200 years even before Boethius. His homily on the Psalter, on singing psalms, familiar from any number of classroom anthologies, including the one that I put together with Piero Weiss, is precisely about the solidarity that arises from the unifying effects of music implemented in action. That passage might also have been written by Rouget de Lille, who composed the Marseillaise, or by Pierre, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, is it De Gater or De Gater or De Gater? He was Belgian, so I don't know whether to say it in Dutch or say it in French. But you know who he was. He composed L'Internationale. Or Horst Wessel, if he was indeed the author of the tune to which his lyrics have been sung since Joseph Goebbels declared the so-called Horst Wessel Lied to be the official Nazi anthem. Or by Andrzej Zhdanov, Stalin's culture czar, whose doctrine of socialist realism was heavily, though of course tacitly, indebted to Tolstoy's ideas about artistic ethos, particularly the infectious power of music. And now we may begin to understand the taboo on the matter of musical ethics in the name of pure aesthetics, against which I've been working by calling attention to the dangers of music. For a pithy endorsement of the taboo, I call predictably upon Igor Stravinsky, the most usual suspect in this connection, who made the insulation of art one of his life's missions. We can all probably quote his most famous pronouncements along these lines, but here's one you may not have heard. In one of the very last of his so-called conversations with his ghostwriter, Robert Kraft, Stravinsky goes on a counteroffensive against the charge of aestheticism, which he defines ad hoc as the self-sufficiency, or as it may be, the selfishness of an artist who refuses to come out and play. He, of course, rejects the charge of aestheticism, suggesting that it originates in my lack of sympathy with the use of music as an advertisement for extra musical causes, even the greatest symphony, as I see it, being able to do very little about Hiroshima. Indeed, the greater the symphony, this seems to imply the less it can do, and the less it should do. For one of the things this statement seeks to accomplish is the differentiation of high art music from the lower, more ephemeral types that, in the words of the UCLA conference announcement, reflect and respond to evolving political climates. Love it or hate it, high art, and here Stravinsky willy-nilly agrees with Tolstoy, hence with Zhdanov, high art, not to mention, with Tolstoy, with Zhdanov, not even to mention Pierre Bourdieu. High art creates social division more readily than it creates social solidarity. Stravinsky's opinion could be interpreted as a justification of moral indifference, the debased precinct to which aesthetic autonomy, too zealously defended, will inexorably descend. Or it might be seen in a better light as a defense against the subversion or distortion of artworks in the interest of propaganda. In that sense, classical music has been literally a safe space for artists and their audiences. Literally, yes, but I would insist not actually. It's because I don't believe that the space we have created for it is truly safe, and because I do believe that our repression of ethics from the discourse of classical music has indeed harmed it, that I have become so interested in exposing and accounting for the taboo and bringing its premises, both witting and unwitting, to light, in hopes, ultimately, of bringing it down. You may be getting ready to tell me, as I have been so often told, that I'm beating a dead horse. But I have proof that the horse is still kicking. God sent me the proof. God sent me the relevant clipping the very day I was writing this paragraph. That really proves it was God, doesn't it? This paragraph that I'm reading to you, I wrote it on November 16th, in case you're interested. When I dropped in at the UC Berkeley Music Department, which I only do sporadically now that I'm an emeritus prof, and I found the latest music textbook catalog from Oxford University Press containing a full description of a new music appreciation text by R. Larry Todd, whom I'm sure many of you know, and who I, of course, have known a long time, which is advertised as adoptable for the spring of 2017, that is to say, it's imminent, forthcoming. It's billed, of course, as innovative because all textbooks are billed as innovative, but its actual innovations are in technology, not in content. One of its format features is a why listen paragraph that comes at the beginning of each chapter. So here's the paragraph telling us why we should listen to romantic music. Somewhere in the second half of the 18th century, the status of music began to rise among the arts. Until then, music had often been regarded as a diversion because of its association with subjective emotional experiences. But with the transformation brought on by the Romantic movement, including its new interest in subjectivity, music acquired new allure and prestige. By the late 19th century, music's position among the arts had changed considerably. The influential English critic Walter Pater captured music's new importance when he wrote that all art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. I was conducting us because I'm sure we could all have said it by heart, right? All art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. Now, I know that it's unfair to my old friend Larry to appear to single him out because he's only doing what we have all been doing for a very long time. But by quoting a forthcoming, that is not yet but soon to be published, commercial text, I can show, I think, irrefutably that we're still doing this. And what we are doing when we quote Walter Pater is to remove music as an art, insofar as it is art, at any rate, from the wider world. The condition of music, as he put it, did have to do with subjective emotional experiences, as Larry writes, but only with emotional experiences engendered by music. It was not a mimetic theory, let alone an ethical theory, that Pater and his progeny promoted, and only in the mildest and most decorous way was it an arousal theory, for it placed the highest aesthetic value on form, and by extension, that means on technique, thus prefiguring all those approaches to art that I have tried to characterize and, yes, impugn, as embodying what I like to call the poetic fallacy. Poetic from the word for making, so it's the fallacy of putting only the maker's input in our purview. Because it is a fallacy, and we still teach it. While in all other kinds of art, it is possible to distinguish the matter from the form, and the understanding can always make this distinction, yet it is the constant effort of art to obliterate it, wrote Pater to explain his famous dictum that we all know by heart. As to why I regard it as a fallacy, Pater stipulated that the mere matter of a poem, for instance, its subject, namely its given incidents or situation, or the mere matter of a picture, the actual circumstances of an event, the actual topography of a landscape, are nothing without the form, the spirit of the handling. So far I agree, as would anyone, I suppose, because art is different from nature, yeah? But then Pater writes that this form, this mode of handling, should become an end in itself. And further he writes, this is what all art constantly strives after and achieves in different degrees, with music which has no necessary natural model out therefore in front, thus providing the other arts with an object for emulation. Ultimately, form must banish content from our minds. That's Pater's main contention. All that should matter to us in this view is the quality of the maker's input, and that's why I call it poetic, borrowing the term from the so-called tripartition semiotique. There's the maker's side, there's the receiver's side, never mind the third side. It's a fallacy insofar as it excludes the matching viewpoint of the apprehender, who of course notices all the things that Pater stigmatizes with the word mere. The matter, the subject, the incidents, the situation, the topography, and reacts to them. We all do it when we're listening, not lecturing. We react to it despite being instructed to ignore them, because you can't instruct somebody to ignore anything. The jury will disregard the outburst from the defense counsel. They can't, and everybody knows it. The danger of music lies in the perception, not the making, and to ignore the perceptual aspects, even as one affects to be training listeners, as music appreciation texts claim, that's an act of evasion that lowers rather than raises consciousness. Hence, it lowers defenses, and composers know this very well. As Larry Todd's appropriation of Pater shows, music appreciation received its mandate from the Victorians, with Matthew Arnold at their head. In this country, it was the viewpoint promoted by the old guard of newspaper critics, originally Bostonian, about whom Joseph Horowitz has written so longingly, beginning with John Sullivan Dwight and proceeding through Henry Craybill and Henry Fink and W.J. Henderson and Olin Downs. These were the critics who posited a priori that the effect, hence the purpose of art, although they never would have used the word purpose, was moral uplift. And the higher the art, the higher it lifted you up. That there could be any moral danger in such an enterprise was unthinkable, not to be suggested. But that's already a danger. It's a twofold danger. Teaching people that love of art ennobles them doesn't teach them anything except self-regard. You're left wondering with George Steiner, who to a reporter said, how to explain those who sing Schubert in the evening and torture in the morning? And he was thinking of the Nazis, of course, who truly loved their Schubert, and I think understood him just as well as we do. This is Steiner again. I'm going to the end of my life haunted more and more by the question, why did the humanities not humanize? I don't have an answer, he said. Did you ever hear anything so sad? But that's because he was asking the wrong question. Where did the question go wrong? I blame Immanuel Kant. Right back at the beginning of what we call aesthetics, that change in the status of the arts to which Larry Todd draws attention in his new textbook. Kant, with his insistence on disinterestedness in our evaluation of art, and in its making as well, insofar as the artist should demonstrate no purpose beyond the purpose of making, that's what Kant called Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck, purposiveness without purpose. You'd think that with that criterion in mind, Kant would place music at the top of the heap like Pater did. But no, he placed music at the bottom, precisely because it didn't convey propositions. So while music, he wrote, was the highest among those arts that are valued for their pleasantness, nevertheless, if we estimate the worth of the beautiful arts by the culture they supply to the mind, music will have the lowest place because it merely plays with sensations. Like so many literary persons, Kant thought music was just a pretty tinkling. Or to use his own analogy, a sonic perfume, a purely sensuous pleasure or phenomenon. And the only danger music could pose, accordingly, was the same as the danger posed by perfume, that is, unwelcome diffusion. So let's face it, like another otherwise admirable person, Vladimir Nabokov, Kant was militantly tone-deaf. And at least one of his contemporaries knew it and called him out. This is the clipping from God, which, though I am presenting it in conclusion, was the one that started this whole talk on its way, when I received from the University of California Press a book for blurbing, Philip Bollman's brilliantly annotated edition of the musical writings of Johann Gottfried Herder. Now, I, of course, knew Herder as the philosopher whose study of Baltic folk songs had laid the foundation for romantic nationalism. And the word folk song is Herder's coinage, Volkslied. That was his idea. And I knew his theories about music and language, but what Bollman's edition first brought to my attention was his last treatise, which was called Caligone, if that's how you say it, written in 1800, the last year of the 18th century, when music was on the brink of its fatal embrace of the work concept, as Lydia Gurr, who is among us tonight, has made us all acutely aware. Herder names Kant. He never names Kant. Herder never says the word Kant, but he paraphrases Kant so closely that I don't think we're left in any doubt as to whose recent writings on music Herder found to be contrary to all experience. How can you prefer the visible to the audible, he wants to know, Herder wants to know. Here, of course, he's paraphrasing another unnamed but easily recognized predecessor, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and his Laocoon, a book that I too have often prescribed to the perplexed or the ailing. Lessing did not venture to choose between the arts of time, which are audible, and the arts of space, which are visible, but for Herder, music surpasses any of the arts of the visible. It must surpass them, he wrote. Just as spirit surpasses the body, for music is spirit, related to the power of the innermost strength, that of movement. Music derives its power from its invisible movement, through which it speaks to us, moving us with true impact. And, he wrote, we ourselves, does anyone know how, sense this impact without opposition, but with real power. And now a truly remarkable passage, which will remind anyone who knows them of famous discussions of music by Schopenhauer, by Edward Hanslick, by Susanna Langer, by Roger Sessions, and several of our own contemporaries. Herder wrote this way back in 1800. Every moment is temporary for this art, that is music. And so it must be, for it is precisely the ways in which it is shorter and longer, stronger and weaker, more and less, that produces its meaning, its impression. In its arrival and departure, in its becoming and being, therein lies the conquering strength of sound and its perception. In the ways this or that tone combines with others, in the ways tones rise and fall, disappear, or raise and renew themselves on the string stretched by harmony toward eternal, insoluble laws, therein lies my soul, my courage, my love and hope. You effervescent spirits of the air, come with gentle tones and flee, move my heart and release me to an eternal longing through you and to you. That is just beautiful. And I think it's also correct. And of course, it's yet another metaphor. But it's not just another metaphor. This one, despite Herder's disclaimer when he says, does anyone know how? Despite that disclaimer, this really explains something. It's the earliest attempt I know, and I've checked with some of my philosopher friends, and it's the earliest attempt they also could recall, to actually try to account for the effects of music described by Plato in that passage that always comes first among our source readings. I'll quote the translation that Oliver Strunk used to open his classic anthology that I'm sure a lot of us remember it by. Education in music is most sovereign because more than anything else, rhythm and harmony find their way to the inmost soul and take strongest hold upon it, bringing with them and imparting grace if one is rightly trained and otherwise the contrary. And Herder's idea resonates equally well with some of the latest such avowals, with one of the latest such avowals by Roger Sessions in his book Questions About Music, who wrote that what music conveys to us is the nature of our existence as embodied in the movement that constitutes our innermost life. These avowals of the power of music are at the same time warnings of the dangers of music. Edward Hanslick, so often and so wrongly dismissed as a formalist, who seems to have read his Herder, had the wit to observe that the concept of motion has up to now been conspicuously neglected in investigations of the nature and effects of music, but it seems to us the most important and fruitful concept. And he ensconced the notion of musical motion in his famously inscrutable and untranslatable slogan that music consists of tönen bewegte Formen, sounding forms in motion, or something. He then devoted the rest of his book, having made this definition, he devoted the rest of the book to a very frantic effort to contain the force of this motion. He frankly acknowledged the danger. He wrote, "The other arts persuade, but music invades us." As you may have noticed, Herder's motion metaphor is actually a double metaphor. Or maybe it's a pun, playing on the transitive and intransitive meanings of the verb to move. Music moves, and because it moves us. But as Herder also knew, there's an actual, physical, tangible basis for the metaphor, or rather the many metaphors of musical motion in the physics of sound production. So the levels of motion in music, actual and virtual, are at least three. Do not all bodies emit a sound when they are struck and made to reproduce themselves elastically? Herder asks. Is there not a medium that takes up this sound, carries it forth, and conveys it to other harmonious bodies? What is sound, therefore, but the voice of all agitated bodies, projected out from within? declaring softly or loudly to other harmonious beings their suffering, their resistance, their agitated energies. So music works through Bewegung, which in this context I would like to translate as activation. Bodies are activated, their vibration activates the air, which activates our sense organs, which through a mental process involving metaphor activate our emotions and ultimately our behavior. Almost as if speaking across the centuries directly to you, Lydia Gurr, and the writers that you've interpreted, and almost as giving voice to my own critique of the poetic fallacy. Herder wrote that the product of all transitory arts is effects, not works. This works better in German. Wirkungen, nicht Werke. He takes this very far, so far as seemingly to deny that there can be such a thing as musical form. He wrote this: with regard to the sensations and even shapes that reach us through hearing, we cannot speak of the fixed outlines and forms presented by the eye, for in fact the ear never configures in a fixed manner. Even if tones could constitute forms or parts of forms that would all last only briefly, each tone takes its form with it and buries it. Here, of course, Herder went too far. Our minds can indeed store a series of impressions and constitute them as a shape in memory, constitute them retrospectively as a shape, and therefore, afterwards in anticipation. And such abstracted shapes can be generalized and classified, and there's no harm in this as long as we remember that those shapes exist in us, in our imaginations, rather than in the music. This is how the metaphor of musical form must have started. And eventually, of course, it led to form and Lehre, the prescriptive study of musical forms, which has done a lot of harm. Again, and as promised, we are dealing here with a choice between two viable metaphors. But the primary effect of music, I hope we'll agree, is more as Herder describes it than as Hanslick did, when actively resisting the Bewegung in his Tönend bewegte Formen, he compares music to an arabesque, which is visible and, as Lessing would insist, static, although it must, of course, originate in a motion of pen or brush-wielding arm. What proves the point about primacy for me is the memory of my first full-strength encounter with the man whose genius for musical invasions gave Hanslick the fright that produced his famously regressive, famously evasive theory. And of course, I'm talking about Richard Wagner. And it was in 1959, when I was 13 going on 14. Friends of my parents who had a subscription to the Metropolitan Opera were going to a wedding. And they had to miss a matinee of Tristan and Isolde, starring Birgit Nilsson, whose recent Met debut in the role of Isolde had made front-page news. My parents were going to the same wedding, so the ticket holder's grandson and I got the tickets. I was still a little young for Wagner at full strength, and sitting through the entire opera, even in a box at the old Met, lucky me, it was an endurance contest. But the final aria, you know, Isolde's Verklärung, which everybody calls the Liebestod, hit me with a force that I had never yet experienced when listening to music. And by then, I was already an avid and somewhat knowledgeable, or at least somewhat opinionated listener. It stayed with me for days. And it was, I think, precisely because I was not anticipating its effects of motion and assimilating them to notions of form, but rather allowed myself to be caught up in their unfolding and shattered upon their arrival, that they were so strong. It was harmonic motion or progression, a metaphor, yes, but boy, it certainly seems real, that invaded me and showed me that such a thing was possible. Harmonic motion is an especially tortuous, or you might say sophisticated metaphor, and one highly dependent on acculturation, so it could only affect me because I was by then, as I say, an avid and experienced listener. But it was the very metaphor that Wagner consciously invoked when he wrote of navigating the sea of harmony. I've played Nilsson's recording of the Liebestod to my classes from the moment I became a college teacher, precisely to show my classes what music can do thanks to its motion metaphors, and hoping that it will have an effect on them like the one it had on me when I first heard it. But although I still appreciated its force on those subsequent occasions, and of course I was much more consciously aware of how Wagner was achieving this miraculous Wirkung, I never felt it again as strongly as I did that first time, partly because it was now form to me, something that existed in memory outside of actual elapsing time, that was now apprehended in anticipation, and of course, if apprehended in anticipation, it means I was braced for it. So there are two main musical metaphors, movement and structure, and they're in contradiction. And if the contradiction isn't noticed more often, it's because the metaphors themselves are so familiar as to have become naturalized. We often don't even think of them as metaphors, and this applies most especially to structure, which is often assumed to be an immanent property of music, even by today's professional philosophers. But if you look up the word structure in any dictionary, you will see that it refers literally to space and only metaphorically to time. My trusty desk dictionary, the 1950 edition of the American College Dictionary, which has been on my desk a long, long time, gives 7 meanings for the word structure. Now here's the last one. The manner in which atoms in a molecule are joined to each other, especially in organic chemistry, where it is represented by a diagram of the molecular arrangement. I chose only this one to quote, although I could have quoted all 7. Trust me, they're all about space. But I quoted this one because, as anyone knows who's ever looked into a music textbook, whether music theory or music history or music appreciation, the structure of a musical composition is almost always represented didactically by an abstracted diagram. That is to say, represented visually, which is to say, represented in a form that substitutes space for time. Lessing would object, along with me. And that, I suggest, is how classical music creates its safe space. Looking at the score or at a diagram that represents the harmonic trajectory that, as Scott Burnham says, David Lewin used to say, clobbered 14-year-old me in 1959, and has surely clobbered many of you when you heard it with fresh ears. If you look at it as form, as a diagram, you can easily say with little Alice, why, you're just a pack of notes. If we really thought about what a clobbering piece like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, when danced as a ballet rather than pranced through as an orchestral track meet or dissected in the sterile music theory lab, if we really thought about what it's showing us, we might well be revolted. As we might be revolted if we understood the text of Prokofiev's gorgeous-sounding Zdravitsa, which is a hymn of praise to one of the 20th century's great butchers, or Orff's Carmina Burana, the original Springtime for Hitler. I especially loved talking about Carmina Burana with my undergraduate music history classes at Berkeley because practically everyone in the class had sung it in high school, and they just adored it. But I worked the other side of the street, too. When presenting Milton Babbitt's composition for 4 instruments, which the class reliably hated, I gave them reasons why they might love it. The main reason, it turns out, is not unrelated to the reason why everyone loves Isolde's Liebestod. When the 4 titular instruments finally play their complementary trichords, the 3-note shapes, from which the row that governs the piece is assembled simply and in order at the very end of the piece, the sense of arrival is palpable and moving if one has analyzed the music to the point where one can recognize that a process has reached completion. Even a piece of serial music can have a discoverable and meaningful trajectory, can have a sense of movement. So I hope it's obvious that I am not in any simple ideological way opposed to formal analysis or any of the other things that musicologists do. I too talk about structure, but I try to keep it in perspective and keep it real. My position may be reminding you a little bit of Carolyn Abate in her celebrated polemic called Music, Drastic or Gnostic, which is another plea to study Wirkung rather than Werke. But I reject her third sentence. I'm sure you all remember what her third sentence was. Her third sentence is, shouldn't this be what we do? Which of course really means, shouldn't this be what you do? And all that follows from that. And if it were my article, I would have called it Music, Drastic, and Gnostic. Both need attention. We can go on studying Werke alongside Wirkung, fine with me. The thing is to get rid of taboos, not to exchange old ones for new ones. I don't know whether that will stop our orchestras from becoming charities, but if talk about music engages difficult, dangerous issues like the ones I have sought to raise, it may become more engaging, and perhaps more listeners will be engaged by the talk and then by the music. Thank you very much. Does that mean you agree? We'll see. Scott, you come in there, right?
Okay. Well, have a seat. So Richard and I have actually been having a conversation for most of the afternoon today. So we're probably going to have kind of a micro conversation. We're a little conversed out. Of course, you weren't there, and we didn't videotape it or anything. But we'll give you sort of a, as I say, a micro conversation. And perhaps the worst way to start such a conversation is to invoke Beethoven. Because if you want to keep it brief, but I was thinking when I was listening to those marvelous things that Herder said, and certainly Schopenhauer was probably reacting to Beethoven's music, and that sense of motion, that visceral sense in his music in particular, has often prompted me when I give public lectures about Beethoven. I have one that I've done many times, which I call the Beethoven difference, and it begins like this. Why is this composer different from all other composers? And then I go on to say that in some sense he's more than a composer, because the music is sort of morally dangerous in the sense that you're developing. It's been appropriated by all sorts of regimes under the name of brotherhood. And one such regime, easily the most noxious of all, made it into my classroom once in an indirect way. And I just wanted to tell this little story and ask you to react to it. So I was playing a Furtwängler recording of the slow movement from the Ninth to my undergraduates. And boy, I mean, the way that he stretches the tempo at the beginning of that thing. You may remember there's a little chromatic bump in the bass line. And compared to how Furtwängler does it, it's just a speed bump for most composers, most conductors. He really makes a thing out of it and all this. And it's a live recording, and it was recorded in Berlin, and it was recorded in the maybe 1942, I think, or thereabouts.
April 20th. I know because that's Hitler's birthday. That's what they were celebrating in the night.
Oh boy, I didn't know that. Well, that even adds more to this. So then we heard some coughing. And then I explained to the students as this beautiful music kept playing, that due to the placement of the mics in the Berlin concert hall, the microphones, that coughing was clearly coming out of the foremost box of the second level. And so what they were hearing was the coughing of high-ranking Nazis, interspersed with the sound of this movement. And as soon as I said that, one of my students went berserk. He said, "Turn it off now! Turn it off!" So I did, and that led to a discussion. It was a great example, perhaps, of the collision of ethical and aesthetic, and how difficult that is for us to process, particularly with a composer whom we've come to love, or at least I have, so deeply. And so this whole idea of the power of music, it's almost like a plutonium or something. It's really powerful, but also perhaps really dangerous. So what kind of a space are we in when we're listening to Beethoven with this kind of awareness of what his music has been used for?
Ask me something easier, please. This isn't on, is it? Okay. You know, I've used that performance too. The last 4 minutes of it, that is to say the end of the finale of the ninth, are available as a film on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it, but about 500,000 people have. I know from seeing how many clicks, you know, how many hits, because I've often used this in class to raise this very question. It was my favorite example. And I love particularly listening to the, not to the coughs of the high-level Nazis, but to watch them reacting when the chorus is singing, Alle Menschen werden Brüder. What does that mean to a Nazi? But it meant something because they were all very much inspired by it. And I'm sure they love Beethoven just as much as we do. And I am not prepared to say that our understanding of Beethoven is more authentic than theirs, because I don't know what that would even mean, an authentic understanding of Beethoven. I know that if we were going to judge the German canon by the reactions of Nazis, we would have to throw Beethoven out along with Karl Orff, because, you know, they were both very successful in Nazi Germany, as was Bach, as was Bruckner. We could keep Mahler, so that's a consolation. But, you know, that's why I say ethics and aesthetics are independent variables. Some things are both, well, you know, the Greeks have a term, that's the origin of the title of Herder's treatise, Kaligona, kalon, which in Greek means beautiful, but in both the aesthetic and the moral sense. They combine the two senses in one word. And I'm saying that that is not the case. I'm sure they had other words if they wanted to talk about those things independently, but to me, it's important to realize that ethics and aesthetics are not mutually correlated. They are independent variables. Something can be both good morally and aesthetically. Something can be good aesthetically but not morally, or the other way around. And I'm sure we could all think of examples of this. So is Beethoven good or bad? It all depends. It depends as much on who's listening and talking as it is on who's playing and what they're playing.
Good answer. Well, and
Oh, I got it.
also, I was struck by so many things in your talk. And one was this thing that Hanslick said, that music doesn't just persuade, it invades. There was actually a PhD dissertation at Princeton about 20 years ago by a guy named Elliot Handelman. I don't think he's in the field any longer. But it was called Music as Secondary Consciousness. And it developed what we thought at the time was a slightly paranoid theory of music's cognitive ability to come in and actually take over your consciousness, like a computer virus would now, and kind of rewire how you're thinking. But this powerful effect and almost manipulative, manipulative, like you talked about the, yes, and Beethoven, surely he's the guy who grabs you by the lapels, right? There's this very interesting privileged place that music has in our sense of our identities, I think. So I often say that we like who we are when we're listening to our favorite musics. But now listening to your talk, I'm wondering about this self-love. Is this self-love all bad in a sense, or is it this, that, and the other? Are you kind of saying that in terms of music being a powerful force on one's sense of one's identity, are you saying something along the lines of the unexamined self is not worth loving? Sorry.
Thou hast said. I'll take it from you. But you know, this business about self-love, if it means smugness or complacency or the idea that because I listen to classical music, I'm better than the people who don't, I think that is bad. I think that is morally reprehensible. And we hear it a lot, you know, from people who are trying to defend classical music against its marginalization. I once wrote a very long piece for the New Republic. The last time I actually wrote for the New Republic, it was a long piece against 3 authors who were making cases like that. And I think that is terrible. So if our love for classical music gives us that kind of self-love, then music has harmed us. And it's one of the dangers of music, as I see it. I don't think we should feel, therefore, that we are improved by music vis-a-vis others who don't have the same musical tastes as we. But if we get a feeling of exaltation from listening to music, and that makes us feel, at least for the duration of the music, happy or feel like we're in the presence of something transcendent, I think that's one of the things music is for. And what you said before about how music becomes, you know, takes over our minds. You remember that line in one of Eliot's 4 quartets, where as you're listening to a Beethoven quartet, you are the music,
Right.
while the music plays. I've had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Afterwards, of course, I start being me again. It doesn't last.
It was good while it lasted.
Yeah.
But so we have a rare opportunity tonight we've been talking about the presence of music and the power of music and the danger of music and what that experience feels like for a listener. And now we're about to experience it thanks to a good friend who is actually going to perform some music for us here. And I'm talking about Adam Kent, who has agreed to perform a sort of bouquet of short pieces by none other than Shostakovich.
A rather strong-smelling bouquet, as you'll see. These are early pieces of Shostakovich when he was living dangerously, you might say.
Good. So I would like to welcome Adam to the stage with our thanks and our anticipation. So we can take a few more minutes if you can stick around a bit. Oh, man, let's take a few seconds more to applaud this again. Yay! I mean, to be able to bounce up onto the stage after sitting still for all that time and boom, just do what you just did, really brings the immediacy of the musical experience to us. And, you know, I don't know if I could have picked better pieces to just kind of get the blood going here. I'm so glad that you played Shostakovich and not Beethoven, for instance. Because those pieces were all new to me, so the experience was really prickelnd, as the Germans might say, and packend, as well. We're throwing the Deutsch around. So we'd like to open it up. There's microphones on either side for your convenience if someone would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your insightful talk. It was not only insightful, but also truly enjoyable. I like the elaborations on ethics, the work, and the listener very much. But when we started talking about Beethoven, I kind of felt that one component we really need to bring closer to our discussion, and that is the component of the performer. The Beethoven performance was particularly kind of gearing into that direction, because I don't think we can condemn Beethoven for being performed in that context, but we need to talk about Furtwängler and his aims, and not only Furtwängler, but the whole Berlin Symphonic Orchestra. So I think really, if we talk about the triangle of ethics, work, and listener, then we cannot forget the performer and the moral role the performer has in that relationship.
Hard for me to see. Is that Tina?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I didn't mean to leave out the performer. I have given some attention to the performer in the past, and I promise to do so again in the future. Of course, the performer is the one who supplies the actual musical event that is elapsing in time. And we all know how, to what extent, composers can be at the mercy of performers. So when I talk about music as an actual, in real-time, elapsing event and the power of music that comes from its movement, well, I should have made it clearer that it's the performer who is creating that event. Of course, following to a greater or lesser extent, and of course, performers always claim to a greater extent, right, the intentions or the behests of the composer, so of course he's in the picture too, but the performer is the one creating the real-time experience of music. And at least once in my talk I did talk about the performer, although perhaps implicitly that was Birgit Nilsson, who was equally responsible with Wagner for making me collapse into a puddle of jelly one day in January of 1959. So I give her full credit.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
I think I can be heard, right? Yes. Speaking of Bach's St. John's Passion and Beethoven, what do you think he had in mind, Beethoven that is, when he quoted from St. John's Passion in the first movement of the A major cello sonata?
I wasn't even aware that he did.
I wasn't until recently, till
Yes,
Richard
so
Good pointed
where
it
is
out to me, actually.
Where is it and what part of the St.
It's in the middle section of the first movement that, and I'm not going to be able to sing it because I'm sort of immersed in so many other things, but it's I think it's a baritone aria.
Well, I will go look it up.
Yeah,
And if you
I'd
want
love
to
to
email
know.
me, I'll
Okay.
tell you what I think.
Okay, then
But
the
this
other
is,
question.
thank you for bringing that to my attention. I
It could
didn't
have
know.
been an unconscious emulation. And I mean, these guys were always kind of sometimes quoting each other with quote marks.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
sometimes just a good tunes rattling around in your head. But that's a very fascinating instance.
It was to me too, because it's one of the most beautiful passages in the first movement. And now that I know that it's actually an aria, I play it very differently. You know, it's almost like seductive, but not realizing that St. John's Passion was so anti-Semitic as well. It's sort of...
On the theme of Bach and anti-Semitism, you mentioned Michael Morrison, who happens to be married to a fabulous novelist, Lauren Belfer, who has recently written a novel that fictionalizes a recently discovered Bach piece that is more anti-Semitic than even the St. John Passion, and what a hot potato that thing becomes through 200 years of history. The novel's called And After the Fire, and I recently read it, and I warmly recommend it.
All right. Another question.
Yes, please.
Which has to do with what Richard said, excuse me, Professor Taruskin.
Oh, Richard is fine.
But I've known you.
I've been calling him Richard all day, so I think it was...
Are you somebody who I know? I can't really see
Yes,
you.
You actually gave me my first footnote in your book on Stravinsky, Barbara Heyman.
Oh, well, hello.
Hello. You say
You
something
can
about,
call
and
me
this is,
anything you like.
what did you say? I'm sorry.
You can call me anything you like.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was very impressed with
Once
your...
had breakfast together at the AMS, now I remember. All
Yes,
right.
you told me about it. I didn't even know that
Back
it was
to you.
the article I wrote on Stravinsky and ragtime. When I was a doctoral student, it was my 2-week paper. If there are any other doctoral students.
2
You were
weeks well
here.
spent.
Yeah, that's what we do here.
Well, the choice was 16th century counterpoint treatises versus Stravinsky and ragtime. No brainer. Anyway, harmonic motion, navigating the sea of harmony in relation to dictolieb. I'm sorry, not dictolieb, but the Liebestod.
Liebestod.
Yeah. Could you
Dictolieb would be a good example too, actually.
now I'm going to get something else, and could it also apply to what makes us so moved by Barber's Adagio for strings?
I'm sure that harmonic motion had something to do with it,
Yeah.
because I too am moved by that piece.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, you and I are not the only ones.
No.
When pieces become standard movie soundtrack material, you know that.
Well, I know
they're very
that. Somebody
effective.
wrote a whole book on it,
Yes,
600
of
pages.
course I
Saddest
know.
music ever written.
I have read your book. So yes, the way in which that has been adopted or appropriated, I think, shows. It says something about its Wirkung, you know?
The irony about that piece, though, is that he wrote it at the happiest time of his life. And when he finished writing it, John Carlo Menotti said, Sam wrote this second movement to his string quartet, and it's a knockout. Even Barber said that, it's a knockout. But it's become our national funeral music, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
Sort of an
JFK and
Oh,
others.
yeah.
Yeah.
It
And
works the other way too, you know, at Beethoven's lowest moment, when he was writing the Heiligenstadt Testament, he was working on the finale of the Second Symphony, which is about the jolliest piece he ever wrote.
Yes. Thank you.
yeah, I wanted to say that. Boy, isn't it something about that Barber piece? As soon as you hear the opening, you're right there. Again, this power that music has to just put you right.
Actually, it's not the moment it opens. I think it's when the bass moves for the first time and it hits in a suspension. And
Okay,
that's
yeah.
movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something about music, though. I mean, how many times have you had this experience where you're driving in your car and a song comes on that was popular when you were in high school, and it doesn't just bring back a memory, it brings back a whole emotional ambiance.
Kennedy's funeral all day long.
Yes.
Samuel Barber, you mean, the Adagio, yeah.
Yeah.
All day long.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's so popular in the air. Yeah, we have a question here.
Hello. Thanks for great lecture. Richard, I'm Sig Rosen. I haven't seen you since Collegium days.
We go back a million
70.
Is there anyone here who isn't a
70.
friend of Richard's?
Well, anyway, I have a question, Richard, about amoral music and what the audience expects from amoral stories in music, such as Popea.
Popea.
Popea, right. I think
Amoral,
all the
putting it
tensions are
mildly,
there.
In the case of Popea, yeah?
Yeah. How would you think the audience played their part in the accepting of this?
Well, I'm not going to say that everybody who went to see Popea then went out and murdered their wives or exiled their former wives. But you know, what makes Popea a problem is that poor Timiro, the last duet, is the most beautiful piece Monteverdi never wrote. Because, you know, it isn't by Monteverdi, it's by somebody else. People think it's by a guy named Sacrati. But it's always performed as the last number in Popea. And once you've heard it, you know, it's transfiguring. It's so beautiful. It's a you know, a chaconne. It's one of those hypnotic pieces. And obviously, the dominant mood that the opera leaves you with is the consummation of their great passion and their joy. But you know, it's a terribly immoral act, or a series of terribly immoral acts that has led them to that moment of joy. I agree. That's the problem. And if the end of Incarnazione di Popea was not a great musical number, we wouldn't be asking this question and talking about it. It's only when it's a great piece and also morally dubious that it becomes, you know, important to talk about, it seems to me. And that's a really great example of a piece important to talk about.
Are you sidling up to the mic?
I am. I'd like to ask about Handel. You alluded, I assume, to Handel's Messiah, or maybe other problematic oratorios that I don't know about, in relation to the St. John Passion. And it seems to me that that example differs from some of the others in that its moral problems are obscure and difficult to perceive if you do not work to exhume them. And I wonder if that changes the responsibility of the performer in any way.
Well, this requires a long answer because I didn't have the Messiah in mind, but I do know Michael Merison's book. He wrote one on Messiah too. And I have a very different feeling about his intervention in the case of Messiah from his intervention in the case of St. John Passion. I really love the book on St. John Passion, and I have mixed feelings about the book on Messiah. Because, well, what he pointed out is that the selection of texts for Messiah, which were by Charles Jennens, a friend of Handel, follow a tradition of biblical exegesis that celebrates the triumph of the church over the synagogue, is how it's often put, the demise of Judaism and the triumph of Christianity. And he points out that there are many elements of the text that could be construed as anti-Judaic, if not anti-Semitic. In one version of this work of his, he looked at I forget what the number is.
Thou shalt break them.
Thou shalt break, yes. And he said this is an imitation of Jewish speech. He thought better of that one. But I don't like that intervention nearly as much as the one about the St. John, because with the St. John intervention, he solved a social problem. And with his intervention with Messiah, he created a social problem. Nobody had been listening to Messiah that way for hundreds of years, you know, until he pointed out. And then he didn't put it, he said there are two ways you could put this. One way is to say, you know, Messiah, which we all love as a wonderful celebration of the radiant Christian message, originally it had a different meaning. Isn't that interesting? Or you could say, and this is what he seemed to be saying, that piece you like so much, it really means this. And you never can say about a piece of music, it really means only this and not that. It means all the things that have accreted to it over the course of all these years. And it's of great interest to know about the anti-Judaic reading of the text of Messiah, but it doesn't mean that that becomes the meaning of the music, or the meaning of the setting, at least. So as I say, I have mixed feelings. The Handel oratorio that I've always used in teaching was not Messiah, it was Israel in Egypt. And I love playing the 10 Plagues because it's all word painting. It's the greatest masterpiece of word painting ever. And for that reason, it is hilariously funny. And so I love to play the 10 Plagues, and they go through the frogs and the locusts and the hail, and the class is having a ball. They're laughing it up. And then comes, he smote all the firstborn of Egypt, and the class is laughing again. And then I wheel around and say, hey, what are you laughing at? Innocent boys are being slaughtered. Is that funny? What kind of people are you? And that's when people realize, well, if I'm lucky, and if the lesson goes just the way I plan, which it does, 5% of the time. But the points I want to make, first of all, is that word painting is essentially humor. And so there are other ways that other composers found that were superior to word painting for expressive purposes when we want to be serious. But Handel was consciously using humor here because a large part of the biblical story of the 10 Plagues involves the mockery of the Egyptians and the withholding of empathy from the Egyptians. And Handel is manipulating us, when we listen to his portrayal of the 10 Plagues, into mocking and not feeling sorry for the suffering Egyptians. And then when we put this in the context of the contemporary Middle East, it really becomes uncomfortable to listen to or talk about Israel and Egypt. So that's the one that I use. And it's great for my purpose, which is always, to make the class feel like, what's wrong with us? The way we're responding to music. It really drives home the idea that music can be dangerous. Great music can be dangerous. The greater it is, the more dangerous it is.
Well, I'm about to make myself the most unpopular person in the room by sadly reporting that it's time to stop. But before we do, I would love it if we can all acknowledge the fabulous lecture we've heard tonight and taking these questions so beautifully. Thank you, Richard. And thank you.